Beneath the continents, beyond the reach of drills and light, lies a world that ancient maps, monks, and explorers all describe but science has quietly avoided. What if the solid ground under your feet is not just rock and magma, but the roof of an older realm that chose to disappear, and tonight we follow the traces it left behind to see how far that possibility goes. If you're following this descent through myth, geology, and silence, you already know the surface story is incomplete. Stay with us, because once we start lining up the forgotten naps, the murmured prayers, and the strange mechanical pulses rising from below, the ordinary picture of Earth begins to crack in ways that are hard to unline a sea, and something else starts to hunt through the gaps. What waits inside that fracture is where our journey begins next. Picture a table in a dim archive, lit by a single lamp where the edges of parchment have curled with centuries of handling and neglect. On some of these ancient maps, in margins and corners that few people read, you find sketched not just mountains and rivers, but hints of passages, chambers, and inner lands drawn beneath the familiar continents, as if the cartographer believed the world had multiple floors. Alongside the maps, there are travelogues from monks and explorers who wrote in careful, steady hands about doors in remote mounds, tunnels breathing warm air, and teachers who spoke of cities beneath the crust as commonly as we speak of distant countries. The official view tells us these are metaphors, religious imagery, almost infiltrations from a less scientific age. But what if the metaphors repeat too precisely, from too many places, to dismiss as coincidence? To find out, we have to listen not just to ink and legend, but to the quiet pulse of the planet itself. In a different kind of archive, far from candlelight and vellum, old seismographs sit on metal shelves, the drums once turning with a faint mechanical whisper. These instruments were built to capture earthquakes and eruptions, the sudden violence of a restless crust, yet buried in their paper ribbons are traces of something else, soft, rhythmic pulses that appear when no quake is recorded, rising like a slow heartbeat from deep within the earth. The lines are too regular, too steady to be dismissed as simple noise, and they appear in observatories separated by oceans, ticking in an uncanny chorus beneath the usual seismic chatter. Officially, these were anomalies, unexplained but unimportant, filed away with a shrug in reports no one bothered to read twice, as if the planet itself had tried to speak in a calm mechanical tone and we simply changed the subject. But the pattern those pulses draw on the page begins to look less random where we compare it to what the oldest myths say about what lies below our feet. From the floodplains of ancient Sumer to the high passes of Tibet and the steep stone terraces of the Andes, stories survive that should have nothing in common, yet hum with the same underlying rhythm. They speak of a kingdom that did not fall in battle or vanish in a single night, but retreated, descended into the deep earth around 12,000 years ago, sealing its gates against a surface world about to be renewed by water, fire, and ice. In these tales, the hidden realm is not a grave but a refuge, halls of stone and light where wise rulers wait, machines continue their steady work, and the people of the surface are watched with a kind of distant, patient concern. We are told these are just myths, the way pre-minus scientific cultures tried to explain the terror of sudden climate and catastrophe, yet the timeline, the motive, and the direction downward repeat with an almost mechanical precision. To understand why so many distant voices describe the same underground retreat, we have to align their whispers with the maps and the seismograph lines and see what silhouette emerges, what of history. As we learn it, its civilization rising slowly from caves to cities is not the full story, but the second act of a much older play whose first act ended in descent, not extinction. Ancient maps hint at layers below the surface. Monks quietly preserve teachings about interior realms. Explorers report passages and worlds within, while the bedrock itself sends up a slow, inexplicable beat like a buried engine. And yet we pretend each of these belongs to a separate category: myth, superstition, instrument terror. The counter-minus intuitive possibility is that they are not separate at all, but fragments of a single narrative of withdrawal, survival, and continued activity beneath our awareness. If the earliest and most widespread myths insist that someone went below when the world above was breaking, we have to ask what would doctor such a decision, and what kind of knowledge they would take with them. That question leads us away from firesides and temples and into the silent, humming dark of the crust itself. You and I walk on sidewalks, fields, and stone floors, feeling the firmness under our feet and trusting that what lies below is simple, indifferent geology. But imagine, just for a moment, peeling the planet open in your mind like across minus section continents become floating plates, oceans thin out into veils, and beneath them all, chambers, tunnels, and vast hollows stretch like forgotten cathedrals carved into a deeper layer of reality. The temperature rises, the air grows thicker, and yet in the myths from Sumer, Tibet, and the Andes, this inner realm is described as ordered, luminous, even serene, a place of deliberate engineering, not chaotic lava. That image alone is enough to stir a kind of awe, as if the earth is not just a rock with life on top, but a mansion where we only inhabit the uppermost rooms while the old owners moved downstairs long ago. If that is even partially true, then the faint pulses climbing up through rock into seismograph might be something more than the random shuddering of stone. Old monks in remote monasteries talk about inner kingdoms with a surprising lack of drama, their words flowing with the steady rhythm of prayer and daily ritual. To them, the world beneath is not a fantasy but part of a layered cosmos surface underworld, and sometimes an inner sun or light that does not burn but illuminates, echoing through chants and diagrams passed down over centuries. Explorers who earned their trust wrote of these teachings cautiously, often in the guarded language of their time, as if they knew how quickly such stories would be dismissed by their peers as hallucinal metaphor. Yet the structure is consistent to retreat 12,000 years ago, a sealed refuge, a promise that one day the gates will open again when the surface is ready, when the noise of our young civilizations quiets enough to hear the older rhythm below. To see whether this is spiritual allegory or a veiled record of something tangible, we look again at the instruments that do nothing but listen to the earth's slow, constant hum. Those old seismographs, with their creaking mechanisms and ink-stained fingers of metal, never knew the stories from Sumer, Tibet, or the Andes. They listened with no mythology, no expectation. Yet they caught a peculiar kind of signal, not the jagged burst of an earthquake, not the long roll of an ocean wave reverberating through the crust, but a calm repeating pulse with no traceable event on the surface to explain it. Imagine their needles resting in silence for hours, then beginning to dance in a slow and decaying pattern, like a far minor soft machine starting up for a moment and then fading back into the noise again. Geophysicists labeled these records as anomalies, unexplained but not immediately useful, then moved on to more urgent data, because what uses a steady, context-less heartbeat you cannot connect to a known process. The strange part is how that heartbeat's persistence mirrors the myth's insistence that the hidden kingdom did not die, it continued, deep below, its engines never fully sleeping. Stay until the end, because the last piece flips the entire story. When we stack the naps, the monastic teachings, and the pulses together, we are not proving anything in the strict sense, but we are sketching an outline that is hard to ignore, like a ghost minus image that becomes clearer the more transparencies you overlay. The maps say beneath, the monks say within, the explorers say passage, the seismographs, indifferent and mechanical, say something down there moves, stops, and moves again with a rhythm we do not yet understand. The official narrative, with its neat lines of progress from stone tools to satellites, has no space for a civilization that stepped aside and kept watching. Yet the edges of that narrative fray when faced with this convergence. So we are left with a choice: discard the fragments as unrelated noise, or follow them downward to see what kind of hidden architecture they might be outlining. If you've ever had the feeling that our story as a species began too late, that there is a missing prologue before Sumer, before the first cities and kings, these myths of a retreat 12 millennia ago read less like fantasy and more like a redacted chapter. They describe teachers from below emerging after great devastation, seeding new cultures with fragments of knowledge. then withdrawing again, leaving only rituals and legends as faint echoes of their presence. That would be one way to explain why highly polished stories of subterranean halls, crystal minus-lit chambers, and mechanical rhythms survive in places that supposedly had no contact with each other for most of history. It was war that ended the first chapter. These stories say it was survival by retreat, by descent, by choosing stone and silence over the chaos above. If that choice was made, then somewhere under our continents a memory of that older world might still be ticking. The emotional reaction this possibility evokes is not just fear or superstition, it is all at the sheer scale of the idea, at the thought that our tattered planet's crust might be more like the thin shell of a vast, inhabited machine than a static mess of rock. Think about how small our deepest mines and bar holes are compared to the radius of Earth, how shallow our reach into the underworld has been, and yet how confident we are that nothing of consequence lies beyond our drills. What if that confidence is as misplaced as the certainty, centuries ago, that the ocean simply dropped off at the horizon, that there was nothing beyond? The patterns and myths, the quiet testimony of old maps, and the rhythmic pulses captured by forgotten instruments all whisper the same thing: we have not yet met the full planet, only its surface. To begin that meeting, we have to accept that the ground beneath us may be less a foundation, more a locked door. Tonight, we descend into the quiet heart of this mystery, not with shovels or submarines, but with attention, following the signals, the legends, and the history buried beneath our feet. There is no need to force belief or disbelief. Instead, we can hold the pieces in our hands and notice how they seem to resonate, like separate tuning forks vibrating to the same hidden note. Ancient maps, monks, and explorers describe a world beneath continents. Old seismographs record a pulse with no known cosmiths from Sumer, Tibet, and the Andes speak of a hidden kingdom that withdrew underground 12,000 years ago and never quite let go of the surface. We are not told a complete story in any one place, but together these fragments trace the outline of something immense, deliberate, and silent. The question we carry with us now is simple and vast. If the Earth has a hidden kingdom under its skin, what is it waiting for? And how close are we to hearing its machines stir a little louder? In 1830, far to the north, where the ground stays hard and pale for most of the year, the team of Russian miners sank a shaft through frozen soil, expecting only rock, ice, and the steady drag of their own exhaustion. Instead, at a depth that should have been locked in ancient cold, their picks broke through into a smooth, unnaturally rounded opening, stone shaved as if by tools far finer than theirs, its walls almost polished to a silent sheen. From this dark and unlinus-made curve in the earth, a breath of warm air drifted up, carrying no smoke, no sulfur, no smell of volcanic fire, just a dry, steady warmth that did not match the winter world above. That single, impossible tunnel would be echoed in a different form almost for decades later, when another group far from Russia found carved proof that someone sometime had not only dug into the earth but mapped entire cities beneath it. In 1871, French explorers pushing through a remote, desolate landscape followed a narrow ravine down to a small natural hollow and discovered something there that should not have survived the weathering of ages. Resting against the rock were engraved tablets, not of papyrus or parchment, but of stone, their surfaces etched with images of tiered caverns, stairways descending into the crust, and clusters of structures arranged like cities, all beneath a thick, wavy line that seemed to mark the surface world. The script that curled around these scenes did not match Latin, Greek, or Egyptian, nor any alphabet the team expected to find it wound and looped in an unfamiliar rhythm, as if encoding a language from a civilization that had slipped beneath history along with the cities it depicted. The story of miners breaking into a warm, carved tunnel and explorers finding stone records of underground metropolises begins to sound less like coincidence and more like a quiet echo from the same hidden architect, especially when we listen to what travelers a generation later were told in the highlands of Tibet. In 1906, a Swedish explorer moving slowly through the thin air and sharp light of the Tibetan plateau recorded something that no map could show. The way local elders spoke of a refuge not above the world, but below it. They called it a goti, a subterranean kingdom hidden beneath the mountains, a place of safety ruled from within by a single figure they named the King of the World, as if the greatest power did not sit on a throne under the sky, but in chambers under rock. To the explorer, trained in the logic of borders and elevations, these stories sounded like myth. Yet they repeated with small variations from village to monastery, always describing an organized, concealed domain that would open its gates only in times of surface cataclysm. 3 pieces now lined up: a carved tunnel, engraved plans of underground cities, and a detailed legend of a functioning subterranean refuge. And the pattern deepened when, a few decades later, someone claimed not only to hear of this world, but to hear directly from it. In 1937, a geologist named Richard Shaver insisted that while working with vibrating tools deep underground, he began to pick up something more than the expected mechanical hum. He described voices threaded through the noise, not random fragments but coherent messages that told of an ancient underground empire, of vast halls and running machines that had never been shut off, continuing their work in the dark. According to Shaver, these voices spoke of a divided realm below, of technologies that could extend life or diminish it, all powered by engines whose steady rhythm pulsed beneath our own unknowing steps. Whether we see Shaver as tormented, tuned -in, or something in between, his claims of intelligent machine-backed life under the ground resonate uneasily with those carved cities and Tibetan legends, and that resonance grows stronger when we look at what appeared quietly in one polar explorer's flight log a decade later. In 1947, during a flight beyond the known edge of Antarctica ice, Admiral Richard Byrd wrote of seeing not only endless white, but an unexpected break expanses of green land where there should have been only frozen desert, and, above that green, craft that rose vertically unmoved with the deliberate, controlled motion of machines. These vertical rising machines, as his notes have been retold, did not look like conventional aircraft of his time. They seemed to lift and glide with a kind of patient precision, appearing from the direction of the interior rather than from any ship or base on the ice sheet itself. Whatever else the official reports from that era chose to emphasize, the public facing story contained no mention of inner continents of warmth or advanced machines emerging from beyond the ice barrier, leaving these details lingering on the margins like a whisper cut from an official transcript. If we place Byrd's observations alongside tales of inner realms and running engines beneath the crust, then the question becomes uncomfortable. Were these machines part of the same hidden system whose pulse a Soviet scientist would soon measure, not in the air, but in the planet's own magnetic field? In 1959, a Soviet geophysicist working in Central Asia noticed something in his instruments that did not belong to storm activity, solar winds, or any catalogued magnetic fluctuation. In the data, there appeared a repeating pattern of magnetic pulses, steady and regular, rising and falling like a slow heartbeat far below the surface, too rhythmic and sustained to match the usual chaos of natural geomagnetic disturbances. To him, it suggested some orderly process or structure beneath the crust that was generating a consistent signal, a quiet but persistent beat in the background noise of the earth field. Once you imagine those pulses as the distant throb of hidden engines, the later seismic work done in the Himalaya takes on a different tone, as if the mountains themselves were hiding vast, empty lungs. In the 1970 seconds, seismologists probing the deep structure beneath the Himalayan range watched how their artificial tremors and the planet's own quakes traveled through the rock and noticed something peculiar. In certain zones, the wave did not move as though passing through solid stone. They slowed, reflected, and refracted in ways that suggested large, hollow chambers or zones of drastically reduced density beneath some of the highest peaks on Earth. The data, stripped of interpretation, simply indicated that beneath this already monumental topography there existed spacious voids, not random pockets of caverns but extended regions big enough to change the path of seismic energy. Once again the pattern surfaced, unexplained open spaces beneath strategic, ancient lands, almost as if the Himalayas were the shell and something more complex, perhaps organized, rested in the hidden volume below, which makes the sounds that came from a different depth experiment even more unsettling. In more recent decades, when engineers drove a deep drilling project into the earth on the Kola Peninsula, the goal was to reach farther into the crust than any human endeavor had before, listening as the drill bit chewed into the rock responded. But instead of the expected grinding undrummed of strata, their instruments recorded something stranger emerging from the borehole, metallic sounds and mechanical tones that did not match the drill's own signature, as if the shaft had brushed against or opened into a region where the rock itself was resonating like a distant machine. These tones were not the kind of broad, shapeless noise one expects from fractured geology. Listeners describe them as having a structure, a pattern, the suggestion of engineered vibration buried miles down. When we set those metallic echoes beside the magnetic heartbeat in Central Asia and the hollow chambers beneath the Himalayas, the idea of inert stone begins to falter, a feeling that intensifies when we zoom out even further and look at what modern satellites see when they peer into the planet hidden under structure, with satellite mapping and subtle measurements of gravitational and other fields. Analysts have begun to reconstruct what lies beneath some of the least accessible regions of our world, not in crisp detail but in broad, telling shapes, under Tibet, beneath portions of Antarctica, and hidden below parts of the Amazon basin. The data reveal voids that do not sprawl in the chaotic curves of natural cave systems, but instead fall into patterns that resemble geometry, elongated chambers near moles, and volumes whose edges line up in ways that hint at planes and angles. These geometric voids appear in zones long associated with myths of hidden realms and lost kingdoms, as if the legends and the measurements were to languages describing the same buried structures. When we add these shapes to the warm tunnel and frozen soil, the engraved tablets of underground cities, the Tibetan tales of Agati, the voices of Shiva, Beard's vertical minus rising machines, the magnetic pulses, the Himalayan chambers, and the metallic tones from Kola, we do not end up with proof, but we do arrive at a web of anomalies, all pointing toward organization and design below, which raises a deeper question about why the story of this evidence remains so unsettled. At this point, the emotional rhythm of the record becomes as important as the data itself. Miners, explorers, mystics, pilots, geophysicists, seismologists, and engineers, separated by continents and decades, all report fragments that interlock like scattered pieces of a suppressed blueprint. Each event, taken alone, can be minimized an odd tunnel, a misinterpreted tablet, folklore, a troubled geologist, a disputed flight log, instrument noise, modeling errors, drilling artifacts, or misread satellite images, but together they form a stubborn pattern that refuses to disappear. What if these scattered anomalies are not random mirrors of perception, but the partial fingerprints of a system beneath us, one that is organized enough to carve tunnels, build cities, sustain machines, and shape vast chambers, yet removed enough that we only feel it through pulses, and echoes in our instruments? What do you think is really driving the uncertainty here? Tell me in the comments. If we allow, even as a mental exercise, that then may be an ancient infrastructural network beneath the Earth's crust, part refuge, part archive, part machine, then the evidence trail we have just followed stops feeling like isolated curiosities and starts to look like the edge of a map. The worn tunneling frozen Russia could be a forgotten access corridor, the tablets, technical diagrams of a city minus grid below the Tibetan legends, oral memory of those who were invited or forced to descend the Shiva voices, a flawed human receiver picking up a strong but distant transmission. Beard's Greenland's and rising machines might then be the visible outcrop of a hidden interior, while the magnetic heartbeat, the Himalayan chambers, the Kola tones, and the geometric voids become not random anomalies but the scars and resonances of a complex, ancient engineering project still hunting far beneath us. If someone once built such a world under the skin of the planet and left remnants of it running, then our modern instruments are less inventing a mystery than stumbling toward the edges of its blueprint. And to follow that blueprint further, we have to turn not just to the depths, but to the oldest maps that hint at lands and structures no one on the surface was supposed to know. Picture a worn table in a quiet archive, the air smelling of dust and salt. A single lamp casting a yellow circle over parchment that should show only the world as it was once known. Instead, the lines curve toward the south, past the last familiar capes and oceans, sketching a vast landmass that those mapmakers officially had no way to see. The more we look at these old charts, the more they behave like mirrors held up to something hidden, reflecting cultures that nature whirled under ice, not the sea of blank white our history books would have us expect. What if these weren't mistakes or fantasies at the edge of the map, but faint copies of a survey from an age when the world's shape was different and the memory of it had already begun to sink beneath the surface? To trace that possibility, we start with most controversial fragments ever pulled from a forgotten shelf. In 1513, an Ottoman admiral named Piri compiled a world map on gazelle skin, a fragment of which shows not just the curved shoulder of South America, but a sweeping landmass far to the south with a detailed, ice-free coastline. Centuries before Antarctica's official discovery, this map sketches bays, inlets, and promontory where, according to the standard story, there should be nothing but vague gases and empty ocean. The contours of that southern land, when overlaid with the reconstructed shape of Antarctica's bedrock beneath its ice sheet, align in ways that have unsettled cartographers and historians for decades. It was supposed to be possible for a 16th century admiral to draw a frozen continent, as if the ice were transparent, as if the pen could feel the stone beneath the crust of ice. The question that hums beneath the ink is not just how Piri drew it, but who or what drew it before him. The Piri fragment would be easy to dismiss as an imaginative flourish if it stood alone, a single oddity at the edge of a mapmaker's ambition. But in 1531, a cartographer named Durantius Finus produced another world map that again shows a southern continent Antarctica, with a recognizable outline that arcs and curves in ways disconcertingly similar to modern representations. The longitudinal spread, the general placement relative to Africa and South America, and even the suggestion of peninsulas echo what we now accept as the true geometry of the southern pole. It's as if Durantius was not feeling his way in the dark, but tracing over faint, older lines that whispered the correct configuration of a land. And he should never have glimpsed, if one map is an anomaly, to begin to sound like a pattern asking to be heard. Nearly 2 centuries later, in 1737, Philippe Bois added another unsettling note to this chorus when his own map depicted Antarctic, and not as a single solid mass, but as two distinct land bodies, separated by a channel of water. At the time, no one sailing the southern seas could have verified such a detail. The continent, if they acknowledged it at all, was pure speculation, a white void on the page. Yet the way was split that southern shape into twin masses anticipate what modern analysis of Antarctica's subglacial topography now describes: a divided continent with deep basins and channels hidden beneath miles of ice. It is as though his pen followed a submerged coastline, outlining a geography no human eyes on the surface had the tools to see, sketching a secret that would only later be confirmed by instruments humming far above and far below. When 3 separate maps across the centuries all seem to know the buried bones of a frozen world, we have to ask where that knowledge kept itself while the ice closed in. If these were only European curiosities, we might be tempted to tuck them away as regional myths or shared errors in a small community of mapmakers. But ancient Chinese and Persian chart traditions quietly complicate that retreat by speaking of inner lands and a sea of darkness beneath or within the known world, regions marked not as distant islands, but as realms somehow below the familiar grid of mountains and seas. In some of these depictions, the world is layer-day surface you and I would recognize, and then, beneath or within it, are the territories whose borders are traced with the same care as earthly kingdoms, yet labelled with names that sound less like nations and more like directions into depth. The Sea of Darkness is not placed off to the side at the map's fraying edge, it is inserted into the world structure, as if acknowledging an ocean hidden from ordinary travel but essential to the planet's full design. Here again we find cartographers encoding a second geography, one that suggests an awareness of spaces beneath, not just beyond, the surface panorama. When such notions of inner realms and shadowed seas echo alongside strangely accurate southern continents, it becomes harder to say all of this is just poetic decoration. Modern analysts, armed with radar, sonar and satellite data, have taken the unsettling step of laying these old coastlines against our best reconstructions of what lies under Antarctica's ice, and the result is where the quiet discomfort sharpens into cognitive dissonance. The alignment is not perfect, but it is far closer than chance sketches should allow, especially when we remember that these maps were drawn centuries before science on the surface could even suspect the existence of sublation mountains, valleys, and separations between landmasses. The crucial point is that many of these old southern outlines correspond less to what a sailor of the age might imagine from sea ice and fog, and more to the contours of the solid ground that only modern imaging can touch. In other words, the maps appear to reflect the bones of the continent, not the cloak of ice that hides it, a perspective we should not expect from cultures without our instruments. When parchment from centuries ago traces the same hidden ridges that modern machines now reveal, it invites a question we are not taught to ask in school. What if the problem is not that these cartographers were impossibly advanced, but that they were copying fragments from something older, something compiled when the world's climate, coastlines, and glaciers were arranged in another pattern entirely? This is the pivot that unsettles the mind. Instead of imagining lone geniuses guessing at Antarctica, we consider the possibility of a lost original, an archive of measurements taken when the southern continent's rock met open ocean and its channels ran free of ice. In that scenario, a long, quiet chain of transmission would have carried echoes of that ancient survey through walls, collapses, and cultural shifts, until a Perry, or an Orlantius or a Bois, working in the half-minus light of their time, traced what little remained. The maps then become not acts of visionary imagination, but late minor stage copies of a world that once looked different, fragments of a blueprint outliving the civilization that drew it. If that is even partially true, it raises a deeper question: who, or what, was taking those measurements in the first place? We're taught to assume that any pre-modern mapping must come from ships, compasses, and rough sightings along coast battered by wind and spray. But these Antarctic anomalies behave as if they were drawn from a vantage point the sailors never had. The cartographers work as though they were looking down through the ice, as though they could hear the contours of submerged valleys and ridges. The way sonar now sends pulses and listens to the echo. What if, instead of assuming they stood on the deck of wooden ships, we imagined them as archivists decoding technical diagrams, plans that described landmasses and inner seas for reasons that had nothing to do with navigation on the open surface? In that light, the inner lands and sea of darkness of Eastern charts feel less like fantasy and more like the vocabulary of a culture that accepted layered geography as normal. And if layered geography was once normal, then a map that looks wrong to us might be entirely correct in a system that cares less about shorelines for trade and more about access points to what lies beneath. Skeptical voices will say, and not without reason, that humans are excellent at seeing patterns where none exist, that the apparent fit between old coastlines and modern sublation apps could be coincidence, cherry minor-spicked similarities overlaid on a sea of differences. Yes, if we press and stretch any outline, we can make resemblances appear, and the temptation to declare hidden knowledge is always waiting to speak. But what unsettles us here is that across cultures and centuries, from Ottoman to European to Eastern traditions, independent map-mappers seem to converge on specific repeating motifs: a southern continent placed with unnerving confidence, divided landmasses where I should hide all distinction, inner seas and lands located not at the periphery but beneath. When errors repeat in the same shape, across hands and languages that never met, they stop behaving like random noise and start to sound like an echo of a single, lost original. If those echoes are real, then somewhere behind the known history of mapping, there may be an unacknowledged survey of both the surface and the underworld of this planet. What if the legend of a hidden civilization beneath our feet is not only preserved in myths of luminous cities and subterranean kingdoms, but also in the dry, practical language of charts and coastlines? A thriving network under the crust would need to know exactly how the continents above were structured, where ice met rock, where waterways carved through stone, where entry points could remain stable through changing climates and shifting seas. In that context, a map that shows Antarctica ice-free or split into twin masses is not a bragging right about geographic knowledge, but a technical documented maintenance diagram of the planet's outer shell. The ancient Chinese and Persian references to inner lands and a sea of darkness then begin to look like labels on a schematic, marking zones of passage and hazard below the visible world. If we allow ourselves that thought for a moment, the old maps stop being quaint relics and start to look like redacted pages from an engine, leering manual left lying in plain sight. The emotional jolt comes when we set what we were taught that Antarctica was a blank unknown, that inner realms were myths against this tapestry of quiet, stubborn anomalies. On one side is the clean, official story of discovery and exploration, brave ships edging into the white, seeing for the first time what no human eyes had witnessed. On the other side lies this almost embarrassed cartographic record, where continents no one knew about are drawn with confidence, split correctly, and placed in coordinates that match our modern instruments too well to ignore. The tension between those two narratives is not an academic quibble, it is a crack that runs right through the story of how long we have been watching this planet carefully. And who did the deepest watching? In that crack, speculation grows. If there was once a culture for whom ice-free Antarctica and inner seas were simple, chart-table facts, where did they go when the ice advanced and the surface world forgot? Notice, too, how the language used for those unseen zones, the sea of darkness, the inner lands, carries both caution and intimacy, as if those who coined it respected what lay below and feared it at the same time. Darkness here is not just the absence of light, it is the unknown depth where navigation instruments might fail, where the usual stars overhead give no guidance. Inner lands are not simply far away, they are so close they share our planet's core, like rooms in the same house whose doors were quietly locked generations ago. When we see those turns on a map, they play a double role: decorative myth for the casual reader, coded reality for anyone who knew what pulses and whispers came from beneath. If the maps are part of a language of concealment, then the next place to look is where that language points most insistently, toward the poles and especially toward the frozen silent south. All of this circles us back to a deceptively simple, unsettling question: how did pre-modern mapmakers draw what they should not have known? And why did they couch their most drastic deviations from the official world in the sober, technical lines of cartography instead of the safer realm of legend? We stand before their work the way we might stand before a locked hatch. The paint flaking, the warning signs faded, yet the steel's still cold and solid under our hand. Either those coastlines and inner seas are the greatest coincidence in the history of mapping, or they are the last fragile traces of a survey that once extended not just across the surface of the earth, but down into its hidden chambers. If it is coincidence, then we can close the atlas and walk away, satisfied that our story of discovery remains intact. But if even a fragment of this pattern is deliberate, then the old maps are not just curiosities, they are invitations to follow the line southward into the ice, and to listen for the ancient hum of whatever those early surveyors needed to trot so carefully beneath our feet. When we follow those forbidden coastlines south, the lines on the old maps harden into steel holes, canvas wings, and a single, abrupt decision that still echoes through the cold. In 1946, a vast pushed into Antarctica under the name Operation High Jump, framing its advance as training and science, yet bringing with it the kind of logistics more suited to invasion than survey. For months, crews fanned out over the ice, mapping, photographing, listening to the steady drone of engines across a continent that official atlases still treated as a blank, white margin. Ahead of schedule, with no declared decisive incident, the mission was cut short and the ships turned away, leaving behind not triumph, but a silence that feels less like failure and more like someone slamming a door at the end of a long dark hallway. In the private writings of its most famous commander, one phrase stands out like a whispered code: an entrance through the ice, noted and then quietly buried beneath layers of routine, as if the gate had been glimpsed, named, and then stepped away from. If we listen between the lines of those logs, we can almost hear the tonal shift, the early hum of confidence giving way to a tighter, more cautious rhythm once the flight paths cross the inner, unpaid plateaus. Officially bad weather, logistics, and accidents are enough to explain the decision to withdraw, and we are invited to accept a simple narrative of difficult conditions and mission creep. But that single, stark description and entrance, not a crevasse, not a crack, but something that implied passage hangs in the air like a tone that never quite fades, especially when we place it against the sudden, premature end of the operation itself. What if that withdrawal wasn't a retreat from failure, but a step back from something that should not be approached, at least not yet? The pattern becomes sharper when we notice that, after high jump, the story of Antarctica stops being about heroic advance and starts being about careful, almost reverent distance. In the decades that follow, the language around the southern continent changes from conquest to containment, wrapped in the gentle vocabulary of peace, science, and preservation. Moderators thread a web of restrictions over the ice, limiting who may go where and for what stated purpose, turning vast swaths of the interior into places you may only approach through narrow legal corridors. We are told this is to protect a fragile environment, to keep weapons away from a pristine wilderness, and those reasons hum with their own kind of sense. Yet taken together, the abrupt end of high jump, the murmur of an entrance through the ice, and the sudden lasting decision to ring that same region with rules and reservations feel less like unrelated policy and more like the careful roping minus off of a dangerous machine in a locked basement. The sense of something more deliberate deepens when instruments begin to see beneath the ice, not just across it. By 2001, those instruments capable of reading shapes and densities beneath miles of frozen crust focus on a buried lake sealed from the surface for untold spans of time, a chamber we now call Lake Vostok. What they find on the bed of that black pressurized water is not a random, jagged landscape, but lines regular repeating, grid minus-like structures that stand out against the organic chaos below like straight seams cut into crumpled fabric. Nature can produce patterns, but this is pattern with a taste of order, the suggestion of corridors or foundations drawn in the dark. Drilling begins cautiously, with a promise of pure science and ancient biology. And for a moment it feels as if we are about to breach not just a lake, but a locked archive. Then, as cores and samples come up, the flow of information tightens, data are sequestered. Some of the most intriguing results are quietly classified, and the grid beneath the ice retreats from public view into sealed reports. It is as if, having brushed the ceiling of an underground hall, the hand is quickly pulled back. Those grid marks beneath Vostok do not behave like random fractures they repeat. They align, they suggest junctions where angles meet with a precision that reminds us more of surveyors' plans than of glaciers' slow violence. If this were only one anomaly, we might shrug and file it under coincidence, an unremarkable quirk in a world full of them. But placed alongside a diary that speaks of an entrance, an operation that ends without a satisfying surface explanation, and a legal regime that treats the deep interior as a sanctum, the grid begins to feel like the floor we are not yet allowed to enter. The classification of samples only sharpens that mood, transforming open inquiry into a closed chamber whose contents we are invited to forget. It is in this atmosphere of half-minus glimpse geometry and tightening secrecy that another set of instruments, orbiting far above, begins to detect something impossible. Heat flowering under the darkest cold on Earth. In 2016 and again in 2018, NIS's observations register warmth beneath the ice, where there should be nothing but the slow, even chill of an ancient, frozen crust. Instead of monotony, the readings show anomaly zones of elevated temperature, like plumes rising from below, and a massive void, a volume of space where the density of ice gives way to less. The data do not sketch a simple, solid block of frozen rock, but something closer to a hollowed minus-out chamber, a series of caverns, a negative space that does not fit comfortably with the image of Antarctica as an inert, uniform mass. In legend, beneath miles of glittering white, a black volume the size of a mountain turned inside minus out, warmer than its surroundings, as if something there is not only empty, but active. When we pair that warmth with the void, the continent begins to resemble not a tomb, but a sealed engine whose casing is colder than the workings inside. And just as we sit with that image, older voices begin to drift up from the archives, pilots and explorers who, long before these readings, reported that the ice itself sometimes seemed to breathe. For decades, scattered through flight logs and expedition notes, there have been reports that do not fit comfortably with the neat diagrams of a featureless polar plateau. Pilots speak of approaching certain latitudes and seeing the smooth whiteness broken by unexpected, sharply defined openings, dark ovals or circles where the ice appears to fall away, framed by steep, unnaturally clean edges. Some describe a strange, diffuse green light rising from these voids, a glow that does not behave like the sun reflected off snow, but like something emanating from within, staining the low clouds from below. Others recall an uncanny sound, a high, mechanical whistling that threads through the steady roar of engines, a tone that seems to well up from the depths as they pass overhead, then fade the moment they veer away. On the ground, a handful of expeditions note chasms and shafts that exhale warmer air than the killing cold around them, as if the continent hides vents that lead not to the open ocean, but to interior spaces where the temperature and something else is different. Officially, these are attributed to treks of light, optical illusions, storms, and the normal complaints of machinery strained at the edge of its design limits, noises dismissed as the wind's own shrill improvisations over ice. We are encouraged to believe that pilots, exhausted and dazzled by white horizon in every direction, misread shadows as openings and ice-crystal halos as subterranean glow. Yet the repetition of certain details, a greenish tint, the feeling of air rising from below, the peculiar, almost musical quality of the whistling gives these accounts a stubborn consistency, like a chord played in different octaves by instruments that have never met. Place those subjective impressions beside the objective facts of heat anomalies under massive void, and the atmosphere shifts. The whistling begins to sound less like an illusion and more like the breath of whatever occupies that space beneath. It is here that the idea of gate stops being a metaphor and starts to feel like a technical description. At this point, the pattern of restriction and distortion becomes harder to ignore, extending from the ice itself into the way we are allowed to see it. Modern waities do not simply enshrine peace, they funnel expeditions into specific zones, keeping much of the deep interior accessible only on paper, wrapped in language about environmental protection and logistical practicality. At the same time, satellite imagery, I supposed all minus, seeing eye suffers from convenient gaps, broad, blurry swaths where resolution drops, rectangles of uniform white where the rest of the globe is rendered in crisp, merciless detail. When we zoom closer, some of the most intriguing regions dissolve into smears, as if the lenses slid out of focus only there, or as if someone has painted over the page in a hurry. Together, the legal limits and the visual fog from a double veil, blocking not just our bodies from approaching certain coordinates, but our eyes from studying them too closely from orbit. That dual barrier makes sense if the ice is only ice is only ice is only ice. Yet it makes a different, darker sense of what lies below as a system of entrances that must be kept half-minus known, half-minus erased. We are not asked to believe that we are nudged instead toward other, simpler stories, instrument glitches, data compression artifacts, the innocent smudging that comes from stitching together images taken at different times under difficult conditions. Those explanations carry their own logic, and we should hold them in one hand as we examine this puzzle, respecting the tendency of complex systems to produce strange, mundane artifacts. But what if those technical excuses are only part of the picture, the surface froth above a more deliberate current? What if the blurs and blocks, the restricted corridors and classified calls, are not random bureaucratic noise but the administrative equivalent of camouflage netting draped over a door in the snow? Each time a pattern repeats, an anomaly spotted, Approached, then enfolded in quiet policy and silent pixels, the sense grows that we are circling something we are not supposed to nab, let alone touch. And the more those circles tighten around the same central belt of the continent, the more that old phrase, entrance through the ice, begins to sound less like a lone man's impression and more like a label on a locked hatch. The emotional texture of all this is not the clean oven-touched wilderness, that we are moving through a cordon minus off zone, a place where knowledge itself seems to hit a soft, padded wall. Operation High Jump's early termination, Lake Vostok's gridded bed and subsequent classification, NAS as warm void, the testimonies of openings and green light, the treaties and blurred frayings each by itself as an oddity, a minor footnote in polar history. Together, they form something like the outline of a gate complex outer fences of land ice, inner indicators of warmth and structure, vents where air and sound leak out from a hidden volume below. We are left with the sensation of standing outside a sealed facility, hearing the faint murmur of activity from within, and being told there is nothing there but ancient rock and frozen water. It is a kind of forbidden knowledge that exists not as open scandal, but as a tension between what the instrument what the summaries say. The closer we walk along this perimeter, the stronger the feeling that discovery is not impossible, only postponed. In this light, Antarctica stops being merely a remote testing ground for cold minus weather-gearing drilling technology, and begins to resemble a deliberately chosen shield, the thickest natural gate the planet can offer, a miles minus deep lock around whatever lies in its hidden hollows. If a civilization wanted to survive a cataclysm on the surface and keep its archives, its engines, or even its cities intact, there would be worse strategies than retreating into volcanic cavities under a continental ice dome, letting the frozen crust above serve as both camouflage and armor. The grid beneath Lake Vostok looks, from this angle, less like a curiosity and more like the faint blueprint of such an interior, a floor laid in darkness long before our instruments traced it. The heat anomalies and voids become the signature of ongoing processes, geologic or engineered, that keep those chambers from freezing into perfect silence, and the scattered reports of openings, blow, and whistling turn into the accidental leaks of a sealed system that was never meant to be entirely noiseless. We are left with a paradoxical feeling the closer our tools come to resolving the interior of the southern ice, the more our access seems to recede behind new layers of permission. It is as though each approach triggers a quiet adjustment, a subtle tightening, reinforcing the sense that we are moving toward an answer, that someone or something wants us to approach, only from a distance. This is the essence of forbidden knowledge, not simply that a fact is hidden, but that the act of nearing it is guided, slowed, softened, so we never quite feel the impact of the full truth. Yet imminent discovery hangs in the air all the same, a pressure you can almost sense in the way new anomalies are announced, then immediately framed, contextualized, and if necessary, blurred. The gates are there, the ice creaks over them, the warmth below pulses on. Standing in this tension, we have to decide what story we are willing to entertain when we hear phrases like entrance through the ice, see grids under buried lakes, and watch as public images dissolve into white mist over the most anomalous regions of a continent. One path insists that all of this can be folded into known geology, geopolitics, and human error, that there is nothing beneath our feet but stone, water, and the indifferent grind of ice. Another, quieter path suggests that these may be the outermost footprints of a hidden architecture, gates, vents, and chambers belonging to a system that predates our brief era and has survived beneath it. We don't have to choose definitively. Not yet. The evidence does not force a verdict so much as it demands attention. But whatever stance we take, the pattern of warmth, structure, sound, and silence beneath Antarctica positions it as something more than a dead end on the map. To understand what kind of world might wait beyond those sealed thresholds, we have to follow the signals still humming through the rock and listen to the oldest, strangest theory of all, that the Earth itself contains vast inner spaces, and that somewhere behind those Antarctic gates the machines within them never stopped. What if the hollow Earth idea didn't begin as wild fantasy, but as a careful attempt by a respected scientist to explain something the surface world could not? In 1692, astronomer Edmund Halley proposed that our planet might consist of inner shells, nested one inside another, to account for strange variations in Earth's magnetic field that refused to line up with simple models. To him, invisible layers of matter, rotating at different speeds within the globe, were a more honest answer than pretending the data made sense. It wasn't a myth. It was a mechanical hypothesis about a world humming inside our own. And once that door was opened, other minds would walk through it, heading not just downward in theory, but toward particular gates on the map. In Halley's vision, those inner shells were not neoporetic flourishes, but an engineered minus-seeming solution distinct strata whose motion would twist and wobble the magnetic lines we measure at the surface. The anomalies he saw on early compasses and charts suggested a restless, shifting core, and he chose to model it as something layered, structured, almost architectural. That choice hints at a deeper instinct. When faced with mysterious forces, we reach for images of machines, nested gears and wheels concealed beneath a smooth casing. Halley's shells turn the planet into something like a vast, sealed engine, its inner parts moving in silence beneath us. And in the centuries that followed, others would stop treating those inner regions as abstract shells and start pointing to specific entrances. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, figures like Sins Jansen and Bernard stepped forward with a bolder claim. There were openings at the poles leading directly into those imagined inner realms. They sketched maps with yawning circular voids at the top and bottom of the globe, described expeditions that would sail or march straight into the Earth, and spoke on lecture circuits about lands within, not beyond, the horizon. To official science, they were eccentric at best, dangerous fantasists at worst, and their proposals were quietly ridiculed or set aside. Yet even in dismissal, the fixation on polar regions as gateways left a peculiar trace in our collective imagination. And now, after tracing the whispered reports of Antarctic entrances through the ice, the idea that the poles might be where the shell thins no longer feels so easily discarded. What if those old maps and manifestos were not perfectly accurate, but directionally correct, pointing us toward real anomalies in the crust, disguised beneath the language of openings and inner continents? While the hollow Earth theory as a whole was pushed to the fringes, an odd coincidence remained the same high minus latitudes. Zones that dreamers marked with gaping holes would later become the focus of our most advanced measurements of the planet's interior. Modern seismology, which treats earthquakes like diagnostic knocks on a massive still hull, charts how shockwaves move through the globe and slow or bend inside different layers. From those readings, geophysicists have mapped in and slow minus densities zones deep within Earth. Regions they label LSVPS, large low shear velocity provinces. Officially, these are hot, partially molten zones, but in the raw data they look like vast, nebulous chambers where the signal goes soft. Seismologists will tell us that LSVPs are not hollows in the caverns where a lost city could float in an inner skeleton and inner skite, but volumes where waves crawl instead of sprint, as if moving through something looser, stranger. To stay respectable, the interpretation must remain geological hotter rock, complex convection, plumes rising from depths we will never touch. Yet when we lay these models beside Halley's layered shells, the resemblance is uncomfortable. We have a crust, a mantle, and then great internal regions that behave in their own way, disrupting the smooth magnetic and seismic story we prefer. It was a solid, uniform sphere then, and it isn't now. We've only changed what we dare to call those inner anomalies. And the unease grows sharper when we add sound to the picture, not just structure. Because if Halley and his successors used magnetism and maps to sketch and scene layers, the mid-20th century added something more intimate. The Earth began to speak in low, patient tones recorded by human instruments. From 1949 onward, technicians monitoring deep boreholes, seismic stations, and oceanic arrays reported persistent underground humming and rhythmic vibrations that did not fit the neat categories of earthquakes, storms, or surface machinery. Places as scattered as Siberia, the Kola region, and Alaska all produced these strange, sustained notes, joined by a towering, anomalous sound in the ocean that researchers quietly nicknamed the bloop. It was just a random roar, it was a pattern that returned, as if some buried engine had never quite shut down. And the deeper analysts listened, the more a strange clockwork emerged. Those who sifted the data noticed that certain signals did not just appear at random times, they pulsed every 11 to 12 hours, like a heartbeat ticking through half a day. The intervals between peaks were so steady that the lines on the recorders began to look like the teeth of a gear, each notch marking another cycle of energy rising from below. Mathematically, the regularity stood out from the chaos of natural noise, suggesting something that functioned, not just exploded or drifted. Old myths had spoken of hidden engines beneath the crust, mechanisms that kept the world's balance or powered the lights of an inner kingdom. And now the phrase felt less like metaphor and more like a description of this unseen, mechanical rhythm. If the surface world throbbed with weather and waves, something beneath it seemed to keep its own schedule. Of course, the first instinct of any serious researcher is to pull those pulses back into the realm of the familiar, to blame ocean tides, atmospheric resonances, or the quirks of sensitive instruments. Many components of the global hum can be modeled that way, folded into the push and pull of water, air, and thermal currents that brush against the crust. But even within those models, there remain segments of the pattern that refuse to blur away, intervals of resonance that cling together more tightly than chance would prefer. These scraps of organized vibration become the seeds of unease, small but stubborn artifacts that resist rounding off. And it is onto these orphan tones that more dangerous questions and older theories begin to latch. At roughly the same time that natural pulses were being catalogued, certain declassified files revealed that there had been focused efforts to understand how controlled frequencies might move through the crust itself. Under the name Operation Teledyne, military and scientific teams studied crustal vibrations, not just as background noise to be filtered out, but as channels that could be shaped, predicted, and perhaps used. The very phrase controlled crustal frequencies suggests more than passive monitoring. It implies modeling the Earth as a medium that can carry organized energy, tones, rhythms, perhaps even encoded information. In other words, it treats the planet not as an inert rock, but as part of a machine, or at least as something that can behave like one. And once we picture the globe this way, the line between natural hum and hidden engine starts to thin. What if Operation Teledyne was not inventing this concept from scratch, but stumbling onto a principle that had already been exploited long before our recorded history? When we study how a signal moves through stone, we act like engineers probing the wiring of a device we did not build, tapping here, listening there, mapping which paths ring and which fall silent. The unsettling thought is that an older civilization, one that fled downward instead of outward, might have done the same thing on a far grander scale, tooling geothermal flows and crystalline strata into a network of enduring machinery. In that scenario, our experiments are only crude imitations, rediscoveries of a forgotten craft that left behind nothing on the surface but myths, and those myths, with their talk of inner engines and subterranean power, suddenly feel less like superstition and more like degraded technical manuals. We have to be careful. Speculation glows brightest where hard data fades, and the mind loves to assemble a grand machine out of scattered bolts and gears. Modern seismology insists that there is no cavernous hollow earth in the sense of a second world hanging beneath our feet, illuminated by its own nanosun. Instead, it offers a portrait of layered densities, oddly minus-behaved zones like the LLSVPS, and a planet that is complex, molten, and alive with internal motion. Yet nothing in that official portrait forbids the existence of structures embedded within those zones, any more than our knowledge of the ocean's chemistry forbids shipwrecks on the seafloor. And once we hear that rhythmic 11 minus to minus 12 minus to minus 12 minus density regions, the metaphor of a buried engine becomes hard to shake. Imagine standing in a remote station in Siberia or Alaska, late at night, as a bank of instruments traces out the faint tremors passing under the foundations. Most of what scrolls across the screens is a messy wash of microquakes, human activity, and the constant, soft grinding of the crust. But then every half-minus day, a particular wavefront sweeps through, subtle yet unmistakable, arriving on schedule with a grace that feels almost ceremonial. Technicians log the event, note that similar pulses were observed in the colder region and in distant arrays, and file it under recurring phenomena that lack a satisfying label. To us, looking back, those inked or pixelated lines feel like the EKG of a patient whose heart we barely understand. The psychological effect of these recordings is difficult to convey without listening, without feeling the slow, deep vibration under your own feet. Reports describe tones that seem too smooth, too long, too mechanically consistent to belong to a single storm or shifting fault, like the droning of a machine idling somewhere in the dark rather than the crack and pop of breaking rock. The word hum appears again and again in logs and informal descriptions, suggesting a sound that is not just noise but presence, a steady breath beneath the occasional roar. Even the notorious bloop, framed publicly as an outlier and then folded back into natural categories, sits in this family of sounds that feel more deliberate than chaotic. Put together, they read like the low whisper of a system that never fully shuts down. Old writing spoke of hidden engines that kept the world in motion, devices sealed away after the cataclysmic ages, left to run unattended in their caverns as the surface reset. At the time, such images could be explained as mythology born from thunder, volcanoes, and the unknowable rumbles of the earth. Today, when we watch a graph of deep vibrations marching across a screen with clock-like neatness and label them with sterile codes, those mythic phrases sneak back into the room. The match between ancient descriptions and the mathematical behavior of some of these signals is not proof, but it is a rhyme hard to ignore, and that rhyme becomes louder when we remember the official explanations tend to slice the story into fragments, never quite addressing the full pattern at once. Scientists, to protect both their work and their reputations, insist that the hollow Earth theory is obsolete, replaced by a far richer understanding of the planet's interior. They are not wrong to reject the idea of a vast empty cavity with its own sky, forests, and inverted seas. Our best measurements demand something denser, hotter, more dynamic. But in drawing the line there, they may accidentally obscure a different, subtler possibility. That hollow was always the wrong word, and engineered the more accurate one. Regions like the LSVPS, humming with low-minus frequency vibrations and intersected by rhythmic pulses, could be not empty rooms but territories where natural geology and something more deliberate overlap. To the surface eye, it is all just mental. To a civilization that retreated inward, it might be infrastructure. The timing of the signals, those 11- to -12-hour pulses, has an mundane explanation within the framework of tides and planetary rotation, and most mortals stop there with relief. Yet the mathematical crispness of some observed patterns, the way they hold their interval across days and distances, leaves a residue of doubt, an itch that simple randomness does not scratch. If we were trying to run a vast system off the slow, predictable beating of the planet itself, this is exactly where we would hitch our machines to cycles that repeat without fail. Operation Teledyne's work on controlled crustal frequencies, whether defensive, communicative, or exploratory, hints that someone in our own time glimpsed the same thing and wondered how to use it. And if we are only now learning to tap those tones intentionally, we have to ask who or what might have mastered that language long before. As we stand back and look at this thread, the respectable shells of Heli, the bold polar openings of sins, Janssen and Berlad Stected, Janssen and Berladus LSVPS, the global hum from 1949 to the present, the 11- to -12-hour pulses, and the quiet experiment of Operation Teledyne. A strange picture, but it is not the cartoon of a hollow Earth from old pulp covers, but something more unsettling, a layered planet whose depths behave like a resonant machine, cycling energy according to a rhythm we did not set. We are latecomers, placing sensitive ears against the crust and catching the tail end of a song already in progress. The dread comes not from monsters below, but from the sense that we are hearing the infrastructure of a civilization that long ago stepped out of the sunlight and into the stone. And to find out who built their lives among those humming engines, we have to follow the legends of light and knowledge, said to exist not in the sky above, but in hidden halls of light beneath the mountains. In the older stories we have been skirting around so far, the engineers of the deep are not described as monsters or shadows, but as keepers of radiance and memory, custodians of a brightness sealed away under stone. When we follow those stories carefully, they converge on something startlingly specific: cities of light, libraries cut into rock, and a knowledge so ancient it had to be hidden from the storms of history. What if the humming infrastructure we've been hearing in the data is only the skeleton of something strange, a ray luminous kingdom that never came back to the surface? In 1926, the Russian explorer Nicholas Roerich traveled through Tibet and recorded detailed descriptions from monks of Shambhala, a subterranean kingdom said to be both luminous and physically real. They told him not of some distant heaven, but of a hidden land reachable through mountain passes and inner tunnels, ruled by enlightened beings who preserve the highest sciences and scriptures. In their accounts, Shambhala is lit not by sun or fire, but by an inner radiance that makes blow water gleam, and stone glow with a soft perpetual dawn. To Roerich, it sounded like myth to the monks who spoke in low, careful tones about its gates. It was geography. And what catches us is that this secret, shining refuge under the earth, echoes in texts that never heard of Tibet at all. In the Mahabharata, one of India's oldest epics, there are passages describing underground realms where heroes and sages retreat to holes illuminated by gems and living crystals, bathing everything in a diffused, source-less light. Centuries later, strands of Christian mysticism would speak of inner worlds within the earth where the righteous are guided to caverns lit by a divine radiance, a place between exile and paradise where knowledge is kept safe. On the surface these sound symbolic, but the technical details keep intruding. No torches, no smoke, just steady illumination from the walls themselves, as if the stone is engineered to shine. It was just that there was a hidden kingdom. It was that it worked according to a physical principle both traditions took for granted. And if these were only metaphors, why do they line up so neatly with each other and with what modern explorers sometimes find underground? In the reports of modern miners and speleologists, we occasions where the darkness is not absolute, where a faint phosphorescent film coats the rock or the ceiling glows in pale green or blue without any clear biological or mineral culprit. Some of these glows can be chalked up to known processes: bacteria, minerals, subtle chemical reactions, but others stubbornly sit in the category of unexplained luminescence, logged, measured, and then left unresolved. Imagine standing in such a cavern. The air is still, the sound of your breath the only rhythm, yet the walls themselves are emitting a soft, steady tone of light, as if someone turned down a dimmer switch on a sun we don't understand. Subscribe for more journeys into the hidden past where legend and science overlap in the quiet hours of the night. The official explanations cover many cases, but the stubborn remainders sit like a quiet hint that some of those old stories about luminous underworlds might be descriptions, not inventions. From the mesas of the American Southwest to the sagas of the far north, legends of an illuminated refuge beneath the world repeat with a nerving consistency. Hopi elders speak of their ancestors being led down into the earth by helpers during a cataclysm, sheltered in chambers where the walls themselves gave off light until it was safe to emerge again. In Norse tradition, we find tales of hidden realms beneath roots and rock, places of craftsmanship and subtle radiance, where beings older than men forged and stored things of power, away from the surface storms of ice and fire. Different names, different languages, same pattern. An original descent into a bright, protective underworld, followed by a promised return when the cycle turns. And that pattern becomes harder to ignore once we add the most provocative layer of all, the idea that beneath those shining halls lay libraries. Starting in 1818 and continuing through the 20th century, scattered reports begin to speak of inner libraries found not in ranges and remote plateaus, in Tibet, in the Andes, in parts of Ecuador, The descriptions vary in detail, but the core is consistent: long galleries carved with unnatural precision into rock, lined not with booked but with stolen metal tablets arranged in systematic rows. Those who claim to have seen them describe engraved symbols, unlike known scripts, yet following strict geometric and rhythmic patterns, as if language and mathematics have been fused into a single design. In some accounts, the silence in these halls is so complete that the faintest footsteps ends in echo rolling down aisles of encoded stone, like a whisper waking an archive from sleep. What matters for us is not whether every such report is accurate, but that they all describe the same function: vast, underground memory banks guarded by darkness and light. Think about what it means to carve knowledge into stolen metal, then hide it where fire, flood, and empire cannot easily reach. On the surface we write on paper and screen. Underground, the medium shifts to something that can survive ages of pressure and slow tectonic movement, something that can resonate with the earth instead of rotting in its damp. Even without assuming advanced technology, the idea is deeply practical. The planet itself becomes the vault, the crust the lock, and the tablets the backup of a civilization that expects to be interrupted. The legends say these archives hold not only histories and laws, but maps of cycles, cosmic, climatic, and spiritual, so that whoever finds them can understand where in the great rhythm they are standing. If such libraries were meant to be rediscovered, the next step would be to leave markers on the surface, subtle or grand, pointing down. That is where the modern scans come in, because when we turn our instruments toward the great ancient sites that dominate our horizons, we find not just tombs and temples, but suspiciously shaped emptiness beneath them. Under the plateau of Giza, non-invasive scans have revealed hidden voids and corridors whose layout doesn't match the simple burial narratives we've told ourselves. And some of these spaces appear to be lined or interleaved with layers of mica-thin, reflective sheets of mineral that can insulate, shield, and redirect both heat and subtle electromagnetic fields. In the Taklamakan Desert, beneath ruins that already seem improbably old, similar imaging has shown orderly cavities where solid rock should be, again with signatures pointing to mica-like linings. To a geologist, these are anomalies to be catalogued. To someone following the trail of luminous archives, they look like the housing for something that was meant to stay stable and dry for a very long time. If the surface temples are the visible spires of a forgotten culture, these hidden, mica-lined chambers might be its underground reading rooms. Mica is reflective not only to light, but also to certain wavelengths of heat and radio energy, and its presence in structured layers beneath these sites suggests a kind of engineering that works with the Earth's own currents. Imagine a chamber whose walls are designed to bounce and soften every sound, to reflect and scatter any incoming radiation, to keep whatever is stored within at a nearly constant temperature and vibration for thousands of years. In such a place, a single torch or crystal lamp could turn the room into a softly glowing prism, while any instrument sensitive to subtle fields would register a distinct, quiet hum of focused energy. Put a library, either slabs of stone, sheets of metal, tablets of unknown alloy, and you have an archive designed not just to endure, but to remain legible under changing planetary conditions. If the hidden civilization were wrecking understood the Earth as a machine, these would be the places where its operating manuals were kept. Light in these traditions is not just illumination, it is a sign of living knowledge, of ideas that are still active. In Shambhala, in the underground cities of the Mahabharata, in the Christian visions of radiant caverns, the glow is always associated with wisdom, guidance, and instruction, not with punishment or torment as in later images of the underworld. The caretakers of these spaces are teachers, librarians, archivists of entire ages, tending to a luminous environment where learning is not just read but absorbed through presence. The difference from our libraries is stark. We separate data from power. They seem to have entwined insight with the very atmosphere, the very light that bathes those who enter. If we take the legends at something like face value, the message is simple and unnerving. We are not just missing books, we are missing entire architectures of learning, and yet, Hints of those architectures keep surfacing whenever human beings push themselves into the deep zones beneath our monuments and mountains, where the walls sparkle with crystal veins that catch the smallest beam of a lamp and throw it into 1,000 dancing points, as if the rock itself has been tuned to magnify and distribute light. Speleologists talk about caves where faint bioluminescence or mineral glow seems to uniform, to evenly spread, lacking the usual streaks and patches of a purely natural process, as if a hand once smoothed and prepared the surfaces in such places. The drip of water and the distant echo of shifting stone necks with a strange visual calm, a sense that the darkness is not hostile but waiting to be gently awakened. What if those conditions were chosen, engineered, and then later masked by time until they looked accidental again? The global spread of legends about luminous refuges begins to look less like coincidence and more like a distributed memory of a single, coherent response to catastrophe. If a civilization survived a world-changing disaster by going below, it would make sense for them to reproduce their refuges in multiple regions: Tibet, the Andes, the deserts of Central Asia, the vaults beneath ritual centers like Giza, each tuned to local geology, but repeating the same core design: light without flame, knowledge without decay, security without dependence on the fragile surface. The Hopi stories of descending under ant-like guidance, the Norse whispers of bright craft-halls beneath rock, the Tibetan narratives of Shambhala pulsing beneath snow, all could be regional accents on the same event. In that light, the inner library stop being curiosities and become the central nervous system of a planet spanning retreat. And if the body of that system has gone silent, we still have to ask whether its memory centers are dormant or simply waiting. Because if you had the means to build such archives, you would not only store words and numbers there, you would store ways of thinking. Some traditions hint that those who enter the inner realms are changed by the experience, that the light itself teaches, that sound in those halls has a structured, almost musical quality that rearranges perception. An archive like that would not just be shelves of tablets, but a total environment meant to imprint ideas directly on those capable of bearing them, shaping leaders for a world rebuilt after ruin. The machine-hum we've traced through seismic data may be the low-level operation of these larger systems, while the luminous chambers are where their output is meant to be felt and understood. If so, then reconnecting with such a place would be less like opening a vault and more like stepping into a working engine of culture. This brings us back to the most haunting question in all of this: are those halls now empty, fossilized relics of a vanished people, or are they still tended in secret by descendants who chose not to come back up? The myths are divided. Shambhala will one day emerge and flood the world with its light. Others insist it remains closed to all but a select few whose inner state matches the frequency of its gates. The inner libraries are said, in some accounts, to open only under very specific conditions, when cycles in the heavens and subtle shifts in the earth align, as if keyed to planetary rhythms we have only just begun to chart in magnetic and seismic data. Whether we see this as poetry or protocol, the structure is the same. Access is controlled, timed, and deeply bound to the beating heart of the planet. And if that is so, then the rising chorus of hums and pulses we hear today might not be random at all, but the prelude to a scheduled unlocking. For now, we stand at the edge of this possibility, with only surface ruins, scattered legends, and glimpses of underground voids to guide us. Yet when we lay them side by side, the luminous refuges of myth, the stone and metal tablets in hidden galleries, the mica-lined chambers beneath ancient sites, the faint phosphorescent scavens that startle modern explorers, an outline emerges of a kingdom of light and archives buried within our own world. It is a picture that evokes our more than fame, not a hostile underworld, but a vast, patient library city waiting out the storms above, its shelves and circuits hanging just beyond our reach. We don't know if the keepers of that knowledge are still there, walking softly through those radiant halls, or if the machines and crystals have been left to run on automatic, a planetary archive drifting through the ages. But somewhere beneath our feet, if these legends and anomalies are even half right, The light has not gone out, and in the deep stone chambers the silent work of preservation continues. Picture that luminous archive-city again, insulated in stone, its chambers aglow while the surface above raged with storms it could not yet see. Around 12,000 years ago, at the end of what we now call the Younger Dryas period, the climate system lurched with such violence that geologists find anomalous diamonds and soot fused into the sediments, a signature of cosmic impact rather than slow, gentle fall. That combination, microscopic diamonds from something burning through the sky and a planet-wide layer of ash suggest not a symbolic apocalypse but a literal one. A day or a season when the upper air became fire and the ground drank black rain. If an older civilization saw that wave coming, if it had napped the heavens and watched the sky grow grounded, retreating into the crust begins to sound less like myth and more like strategy. In the layers of earth that mark that boundary, we do not see a graceful exit from the ice age, we see a jolt, a crack, a sudden change whose violence would have had its own low, planetary rumble. The Younger Dryas does not just end its snaps, and with that snap comes a spike of soot and those glittery impact grains, as if the whole atmosphere had been sandblasted and set alight. What if the end of the Ice Age was not a gentle warning, but the echo of something that struck from above, something that made the surface, for a while uninhabitable in broad sweeps and patches? In such a world of searing winds, poisoned rains, and grinding ice, the safest direction is not away across the water, but down beneath the reach of the blast, far to the south, in regions that were once part of an ancient crustal shield. We find another strange trace that speaks the language of fire. In South Africa, geological evidence in the form of fused quartz points to episodes of catastrophic surface heating, where sand and stone were exposed to such intense energy that they partially melted, then cooled into glass like rock. This is not the gentle work of seasonal sun, but the kind of sudden, furious heat you would expect from an atmospheric shock, a burst that turns ground to glass and air to a furnace. A society already comfortable with tunnels, caverns, and subterranean chambers would read rock like this as a warning, a sign that the open ground had become a killing field. The older stories we have from the aftermath do not talk about abstract climate graphs, they talk about water, walls of it, roaring and endless, and about the survivors who fled not just to hills but into the earth itself. In Sumerian flood legends, Greek catastrophe tales, and Hopi emergence stories, we hear a pattern repeated like a drumbeat deluge. A few who are forewarned, and a descent into caves, into hidden chambers, into the stomach of the world while the roar of the flood echoes above them. Taken literally, these are plans, not parables, roots down, refuges prepared, doors that close against both fire from the sky and water from the sea. What if the global flood was not only a memory of rising waters but the public face of something more deliberate, a coordinated retreat into a network already carved beneath our feet? In the Sumerian tales, the chosen survivor is not left to wander, he is taken to a hidden place, a region set apart from the ruined world, a sanctuary whose description feels less like a mountaintop and more like a sealed compound beyond ordinary reach. The Greek strands that mention caverns and chasms after the waters recede hint at a people who knew that safety could lie in depth, in stone that muffles the chaos above, while the Hopi speak of their ancestors emerging from a lower world after the surface has been remade. Across these traditions, the rhythm is the same. There is an upper realm that becomes hostile, a lower realm that shelters a remnant, and a promised return when the cycle turns. It sounds less like three separate myths and more like three regional memories of the same decision to ride out the cataclysm in the deep places and surface early when the noise has faded. What if, instead of imagining the underworld as a realm of punishment and ghosts, we read it as a map of refuges, safe rooms etched into cultural memory? In that light, the repeated descent into caverns is no longer a metaphor for death, but a recollection of stairs, shafts, and sloping corridors leading away from the roaring sky, each step taking people further from the pounding, oceanic hum of collapsing ice and churning seas. The world below becomes less a mystical inversion and more a practical second layer of earth, one that opens when the upper layer burns or drowns. And if the storytellers kept the locations vague, disguising them as myth, that may have been intentional way to protect the gates from the uninitiated or the unready. When we look at the archaeological record after this period of soot, glass and flood, something unsettling happens. Advanced cultures seem to appear not as seedlings, but as if transplanted fully grown. Sites like Göbekli Tepe, with their sudden complexity and sophistication, stand in the record as if someone pressed resume on a project that had been paused, rather than gradually building up from scattered, simple villages. Mesopotamia, too, arrives in history already speaking the languages of cities, measurement, and administration, as if its founders carried an older blueprint and their memories are in something more tangible. What if the true homeland of these cultures was not the ground we excavate, but the chambers beneath it, and what we are saying in their sudden appearance is not invention, but resurfacing? Göbekli Tepe in particular feels like a monument built by a people who remember more than they say, a stone expression of patterns and symbols that do not seem to have a long, local prehistory on the surface. It rises into view after the cataclysm as if someone, somewhere, had decided it was time to mark the world again, to establish a node or a beacon on the skin of the earth while the deeper systems remained below. Its very existence so soon after the trauma suggests that the knowledge to plan, quarry, and align those stones did not have to be reinvented from scratch. It could have been preserved during the long winter in the luminous holes we have already traced. If we think of Göbekli Tepe not as a beginning, but as a message from survivors who had waited in the dark, the whole site starts to hum with new implications. What if the classic story of human progress, wandering bands slowly learning to farm, then to build, then to write, is only the surface story, and there was a parallel track running beneath it all old? In that deeper track, an older civilization, already versed in stolen symbol, retreats when the sky falls, seals its doors, and then, in carefully chosen places and times, sends emissaries back up to plant seeds of culture in a quieter, emptier world. That would explain why the post-cataclysm record in places like Mesopotamia looks less like awkward experimentation and more like the sudden activation of a remembered system, a system with rules, measurements, and rhythms already in place. The surface looks like a start, but the feel is of a reboot, while the stories of fire, flood, and underground refuge echo in our oldest texts. The oceans themselves seem to hold a silent, geometric memory of that lost shoreline. Off the coast of Cuba, sonar has traced grid-like structures submerged far below the waves, their arrangement suggesting a deliberate pattern and their estimated age reaching back to around 10,000 BC, right in the window after the Great Disruption. These are not neat, excavated ruins with tour guides and placards. They are shadows on a sonar screen, right angles and repeating modules where geology prefers curves and chaos. If they are the drowned limbs of an older coastal world, perhaps once linked to inland corridors that descended into safety, then they mark the line where that civilization's surface arm was sheared away by the rising, restless sea. Consider the sequence: a cosmic impact leaves non-anus diamonds and soot in the soil, heat fierce enough to fuse quartz scarce parts of the crust. Ice sheets fracture with a sound like continents groaning, and the seas begin their long, inevitable rise in the early stages. Lower lying coasts and plains would go first, swallowing any cities, harbors, or ports that clung to the ancient shorelines, until only their faint, grid-like signatures remain for future sonar to catch. At the same time inland, rivers would rage out of their channels, carving new paths, while storms with a new, alien energy tore at forests and plains, delivering not just water, but blackened ash from distant fires. In such a landscape, the hum of a hidden machine in a deep chamber might feel more comforting than the ever-shifting roar of the world outside. If we put ourselves into that moment, standing on ground that has just seen the sky ignite and the seas surge higher than any remembered mark, the choice to go underground stops being mystical and becomes heartbreakingly practical. You can either cling to shrinking hills and makeshift boats, or you can descend into structures designed to withstand precisely this kind of storm, with walls sunk deep into bedrock and ceilings that will not burn. The fused quartz and the soot tell us about the violence, the sudden gaps and breaks in settlement layers tell us about abandonment, the flood myths tell us about those who descended. All that remains is to ask them those who descended. Were the ones who vanished into the deep simply erased by chance, or were they following a plan written long before the first tone cracked? What if the end of that age was not an end at all, but the beginning of a long, controlled withdrawal, a late strategic retreat into a network of safe spaces beneath the crust? In that reading, the younger Dryas cataclysm becomes less a random disaster and more the trigger for a protocol, one that turned legends into instructions. When the sky burns and the waters rise, find the gates, go down, wait. That would mean the luminous archives we glimpsed earlier were not built in panic, but in foresight, expecting exactly this sequence of fire, water, and long silence. And when the world above stabilized, when the soot settled and the roar gave way to a quieter, slower rhythm, the same protocol would have called for a cautious, partial return from the surface. That kind of managed retreat and emergence would look exactly like what we see: gaps in the record where population thins and sites vanish, followed by abrupt appearances of adventure in a few favored locations, Gobi Klit, early Mesopotamia, and other early centers of complexity become less mysterious if we imagine that their founders did not learn from nothing, but drew on memories, texts, or machines preserved below while the ground healed. They are not experiments in civilization, they are test balloons, probes sent upward to see if the air is breathable, the climate stable, the cycles predictable once more. In that sense, our earliest cities and temples might be the echoes of a much older song, one that never stopped playing beneath us. The sonar grids off Cuba, the fused quartz in South Africa, the soot-stained layer of the younger Dryas boundary, the flood myths that insist on descent, and the sudden sophistication of post-Milas cataclysm sites all gesture toward the same narrative shape. It is not a story of total extinction nor of a simple, linear rise, but of a crescent retreat, followed by a careful, partial return, a civilization bending like a reed, not shattering like glass. Emotionally, that changes everything. The hidden world beneath our feet ceases to be a realm of ghosts and monsters, and becomes a shelter built by ancestors who refused to surrender their knowledge to the flames and the waves. And if their withdrawal was deliberate, timed to cycles and impacts they understood, then the hums and pulses we detect today may be the steady, mechanical heartbeat of that same hidden kingdom, still listening, still waiting, and still deciding when, if ever the surface has earned a full reunion. By the time we reach the 20th century's deepest experiments, we're no longer talking only about myths and stone, but about steel pipe and spinning drill heads biting into the crust to chase an echo. In the early 1960s, Project Moho set out to pierce the oceanic crust, and in 1989 the coal, a super-deep borehole, reached farther down into continental rock than any human-made structure had gone before. Yet both stopped suddenly, long before their original depth targets. Officially, it was cost, politics, and technical fatigue. Unofficially, engineers speak of hollow resonances and machine signatures that began to hum back up the shaft once a certain layer was breached. It was the solid, chaotic roar of random rock they heard, but a patterned, steady tone that suggested structure where there should only have been blind density. The same quiet refrain would surface again, far to the south, beneath the ice. On the coal rigs, operators described moments when the drill string began to vibrate in a way that did not match its rotation, as if some deeper rhythm had caught hold of the metal and was playing it like a string. Acoustic logs, those visual tapes of sound bouncing back from the depths, showed sharp, repeating echoes at specific intervals, almost like radar pinging off a chambered hull instead of rough, irregular stone. The language in internal notes is cautious, non-committal, but the phrase anomalous hollow resonance appears enough times to suggest concentrated concern rather than passing curiosity. One after another, the grand promises of these deep projects faded. Sites were capped and the data was filed away, leaving behind a whisper of something that did not want to be drilled through. Years later, when satellites began to map the ice in detail, that same sense of deliberate geometry emerged again from beneath Antarctica. In the early 2000s, as orbital sensors and ground-minus penetrating radar swept the white continent, researchers began to notice voids that did not look like ordinary caves or lelt channels. Beneath the ice sheet, especially in certain basins, the returns suggested elongated, rectilinear spaces, geometric voids whose sharp edges and repeated angles chimed against the mind like a mechanical rhythm. Alongside those shapes, magnetometers picked up a second anomaly, a pulsing magnetic signal, repeating roughly every 12 hours, rising and falling like a faint heartbeat beneath a frozen wreckage. It was a burst from the sun, nor the random jitter of instruments. It kept time with itself, as if something down there were switching on and off with a schedule. The pattern matched nothing in the usual catalogues, yet it refused to go away, forcing us to ask what kind of system could maintain such a steady pulse in the dark. 12 hours is a curious interval, half a day, half a rotation, a division between light and darkness on the surface, but below the ice that cycle should be meaningless. Some teams tentatively suggested tidal interactions, electromagnetic quirks, or minor solar effects, but the signal's persistence and coherence were stubborn, like the tick of a metronome that does not drift over months and years of observation. What if this was a background noise we had overlooked, but a timed operation we had only just begun to hear, a kind of internal clock cycling in phase with the turning world above? If the ancient accounts of hidden engines were poetic memories of a subterranean infrastructure, then a 12-hour pulse sounds remarkably like a shift change, a status ping, or a safety cycle. The possibility is unsettling not because it implies presence, but because it suggests maintenance, ongoing, deliberate, and indifferent to whether we listen. As our instruments improved further, the planet started to speak back in a way that sounded disturbingly like a language. From around 2015 onward, the global seismic network, thousands of sensitive stations listening for earthquakes began registering low-frequency vibrations that did not fit any known template. These were not the sharp spite of a quake or the smooth roll of ocean micro-seisms, but structured trains of energy emerging from deep within the crust, often far below the layers we typically associate with tectonic motion. When researchers ran these signals through pattern-recognition software originally designed for human speech, something unsettling happened. The algorithms flagged them as speech-like, with repeating intervals and clustered bursts resembling syllables and pauses. It is not that the Earth is suddenly talking in words, but that its deep vibrations, for the first time, resemble the rhythms of deliberate communication rather than the random churn of stone. The question that follows is simple and disquieting. If this is a message, who is speaking, and to whom? If you're following this descent through myth, geology, and silence, you already know the surface story is incomplete, and nowhere is that more evident than in the one expedition that may have crossed the line from listening to entry. In 2017, a small private Antarctic venture headed toward a sector where those geoelectric voids and magnetic pulses intersected most strongly, carrying equipment capable of probing not just the ice, but whatever lay below it. The official records say they encountered severe weather and were lost a tragedy in an unforgiving environment. But tucked away in the archive of intercepted transmissions is a final, stark message attributed to their lead depth achieve, entry confirmed. There is no follow-up, no coordinates, no description of what that entry looked like, only a silence as thick as the ice itself. If we take that phrase at face value, then, at least once in recorded history, someone may have stepped through a gate we weren't ever meant to find. What would it mean to push through the bottom of a glacial shaft into a geometric void synchronized to a 12-hour pulse, with the planet's deep crust humming in speech-like patterns around you? We like to imagine such a discovery would be announced with fanfare and haste, but history suggests otherwise. The more disruptive a finding is to our sense of safety and control, the more likely it is to be quietly wrapped in technical language and let slip beneath the surface of public attention. In that sense, the 2017 disappearance acts less like an isolated tragedy and more like a pressure point in the narrative, a moment where descent became too literal, too close to the machine room to be safely discussed in open forums. The message entry confirmed hangs there like a torn fragment of a map, hinting at a door we cannot see but can feel in the data. And in the years that follow, the whole planet begins to ring in a way that suggests that door was not the only thing that opened. In 2022, instruments across the world registered a global tremor that did not behave like any known seismic event. No fault slip, no volcanic surge, no storm-induced shake, just 3 clean pulses circling the globe. The energy moved through the Earth's interior not as a chaotic wavefront, but as a crisp, repeating signal, each pulse uniform in strength and timing like 3 measured knocks on a colossal buried door. Analysts noticed that this was not a 1- off. It fit into a broader 6- rhythm of subtle, non- seismic disturbances that had been quietly accumulating in the records, as if some deep mechanism were conducting periodic system checks. An earthquake dissipates, it roars and fades, its echoes scattering into noise, but this 2022 tremor behaved more like the controlled test of a vast, coherent structure. It left behind not devastation, but a question: what kind of machine uses the entire planet as its chassis for a diagnostic ping? If we step back and lay these rhythms side by side, the 12- magnetic pulse beneath Antarctica, the speed -like vibrations from the crust, the 6- cycle punctuated by the triple knock of 2020, a pattern begins to emerge that refuses to look accidental. Each element could be dismissed on its own as an oddity of rock and field, an instrumental artifact there, but together they resemble the overlapping motions of a system coming slowly online or steadily rebalancing. The earlier drilling projects, halted at the threshold of hollow resonances and machine signatures, start to feel less like technical failures and more like intentional taps on the outer casing of that same hidden apparatus. What if the hum we hear in our deepest boreholes and the pulses we track from orbit are not simply byproducts of geology, but feedback from a buried infrastructure designed to ride out cataclysms and then, in due time, recalibrate the world above? If so, the next anomaly is not random, it is scheduled. Threaded through all of this is another subtler change: the Schumann resonance, the set of natural frequencies at which the space between Earth's surface and its ionosphere rings has been creeping upward. Official explanations focus on shifts in global lightning patterns and atmospheric conditions, and those factors no doubt play their role, but from our vantage point, it is difficult not to hear it as the background tone of the planet rising, as if the whole electromagnetic chamber were being tuned. When you place that rising frequency against the structured deep crust vibrations and the precise cycles of Antarctic pulses, the image is less of a sick planet and more of an enormous, slow machine adjusting its own settings. In mythic language, the Earth is waking up. In technical terms, a multi-layered resonance system is sliding into a new operating state. Either way, we are on the surface of the device that is changing its own song. We stand, then, between 3 main interpretations, each compelling in its own way and none complete. One says that what we are hearing is the afterlife of a pre-cataclysmic civilization, machines and chambers still functioning below, cycling, pulsing, and perhaps even listening as their descendants watch the surface for signs that we have learned from the last fall. Another insists that all of this is the blind yet intricate work of physics, that resonances and pulses need no hidden engineers, only complex boundary conditions and a restless call. A third possibility sits quietly between them: that an ancient culture learned to harness and shape these natural rhythms, building their refuges, archives, and engines into the grain of the planet's own music, so that what we detect today is both geological and intentional. In that frame, the line between cave and cathedral, fault and machine, becomes a matter of use rather than origin, whichever lens we choose. One fact remains: as our instruments become more sensitive, the Earth's interior stops looking mute and starts behaving like a layered, responsive system. We drill and are answered with machine signatures. We map the ice and find geometric voids. We eavesdrop on the crust and hear structured vibrations that trip the same algorithms we use to parse human voices. Our probes descend, our data end, and in between those motions, the old legends of a hidden kingdom, humming away beneath the scars of a forgotten cataclysm, no longer seem like sheer fantasy but like metaphors for a process we are only now beginning to measure. We thought the descent would be entirely ours would be entirely ours and after of going down with cameras and drills, but the rising pulse suggests the other side can, in its own way, come up. For now, the response is subtle at Rema here, a magnetic heartbeat there, a triple knock in 2022 that echoes faintly in the instruments and then fades. Yet the deeper implication is hard to escape. If there is a schedule to these pulses, a rhythm to these hums, then we are already inside someone else's timing, moving along a calendar etched not in stone tablets, but in cycles of energy. Our youngest tools are brushing against the oldest layers of an arrangement that has outlived floods, impacts, and the rise and fall of surface empires, and the more we press, the louder the deep systems seem to sing. There is no guarantee that the hidden civilization, if it survives a machine archive or something stranger ager, wants to be found, and no assurance that our curiosity will be greeted as wisdom rather than as another threat. For now, all we can do is listen as the planet's frequency climbs and its buried pulses keep perfect time, as steady as a mechanical heartbeat in a sealed chamber, somewhere far below the crust, beneath ice and stone and the noise of our own cities. Something continues to hum, cycling through its ancient routines, as if waiting for a signal we have not yet learned how to send.